In 2008, an Australian horror film called Acolytes was released. The film stars Joel Edgerton and Michael Dorman, and focuses on some teenagers who stumble onto a murder. Things very quickly spiral out of control, as one might expect. Now, I haven't personally seen Acolytes, though it did win awards at film festivals. But in 2024, a ton of people started leaving negative, angry reviews on this 2008 horror film's Rotten Tomatoes page. For a film that had 8 official reviews on Rotten Tomatoes previously, it seemed baffling that now hundreds of people suddenly were discussing this obscure film. But why? Why in 2024? Maybe Joel Edgerton mentioned it in an interview. Maybe it was referenced in another popular show. Oh no, it's because the movie shares the same name as The Acolyte, the newest Star Wars series that has itself been getting review bombed to hell and back since before it even came out. I'm sure the fan backlash has been reasonable and grounded in logical things like fire existing in space in a Star Wars film, space lesbian witches just existing and wiggling their fingers around in some scenes, an established concept in Star Wars lore that the Force can fertilize eggs in a woman's womb that has happened at least once before, occurred before it happened the first time we heard about it.
Who was his father?
There was no father. I carried him, I gave birth, I raised him.
I carried them. I created them. And what happens if the Jedi discover how you created them?
It is possible he was conceived by the midichlorians.
This is the criticism the show's facing? Seriously? This is it? This is the extent of it? Alright. Now, we can chalk up the 2008 Acolytes film review bombing to a simple error. People just searched The Acolyte and they just left a bad review. Didn't look at what the movie was they were reviewing, but okay. It is, of course, unless it happened a second time, which it did. The 2022 Star Wars fan film The Acolyte was review bombed as well, confused for the TV show that's going on currently. I mean, look, let's be honest. If you're gonna hate on something, make sure you're hating the right target, alright? That's all I'm saying. So why is The Acolyte being lambasted so much? Well, we're going to find out in a moment by going through several videos released over the course of The Acolyte's run thus far, or at least up until the point where this video is released. As of this recording, episode 5 came out, and I will update this video when episode 6 comes out with any tidbits if necessary. And maybe we'll make a follow-up when the show's over to see if the criticisms made across the show's timeline were rendered obsolete by the show's ending. Or, maybe a twist happened. Now, some people have made the argument that the review bombing is just a reaction to the show's quality. The show's not good, they say, so obviously more people are going to be angry about it. But it doesn't really match up with trends we've seen previously, especially for Star Wars. Consider this. In the first 3 weeks following The Acolyte's release, with only 4 episodes out, it received more audience reviews than the first 3 seasons of The Mandalorian across its entire run. As of this recording, The Acolyte has 25,000 user reviews submitted on Rotten Tomatoes. By comparison, The Mandalorian has 17,500 reviews across all 3 seasons. And that debuted back in 2019. A lot of people have had time to be angry at that show. Obi-Wan Kenobi, another show plagued by controversy, received 10,000. The Clone Wars, the longest running show that Star Wars has ever put out, amassed only 6,000. This dwarfs, as well, all reviews submitted for mainstream films got a lot of attention. The Batman has fewer user-submitted reviews on Rotten Tomatoes than The Acolyte. Are you going to tell me that The Batman is less culturally significant than The Acolyte? Really? You going to tell me that? Okay. This is a bigger wave of controversy than even with the Captain Marvel debate back in 2019, where Rotten Tomatoes actually reworked its entire user-submitted review function in order to combat review bombing. Review bombing, for those who aren't aware, is the process where people leave negative reviews en masse, sometimes written by bots, sometimes just copied and pasted from a copy pasta, ad nauseum. And you can tell things are review bombed sometimes when, let's say, extreme amounts of negative reviews are submitted minutes after a thing debuts, before it even debuts, or if the information in the review that's submitted is completely irrelevant and erroneous. All of this we have seen so far with various Acolyte user reviews. What makes this more complicated is all the Acolyte critics are also simultaneously saying, hey, no one's watching The Acolyte. So which is it? Either The Acolyte is on track to be one of the most widely watched things ever, surpassing The Batman and The Mandalorian in terms of relevancy, or these reviews are fake. or the hype, or it's part of a movement to lower the audience rating on The Acolyte for arbitrary reasons, because people care about that sort of thing, I guess.
I used to think that it would take one really great Star Wars project to bring all of us together. But now I realize it takes one really bad Star Wars project to unite so many of us. I remember during the live stream for episode 3 of The Acolyte, there were so many of you at the end that were saying, I was totally on board with episode 1 and 2. In fact, I thought all you guys were toxic for not liking it, this and that, but this is too much. I can't take this. This is bullshit. And so many people are now changing tune and kind of waking up. And I think, it's interesting. There's a lot.
I'm sorry, changing tune. The show was getting review bombed from the first episode. What are you talking about, man? And some of the criticisms themselves have been very strange. For example, one criticism I saw was from a user on Twitter called That Star Wars Girl, who has amassed a small following. She argued that the character Seoul was named in reference to the capital of South Korea, even though they're pronounced differently. I'm bad with pronunciation, but I'm pretty sure Seoul and Seoul or Seoul are pronounced differently, depending on who you ask. They're definitely spelled differently, for sure, in the English language. Also, it's clear Seoul is named Seoul because of solar, or perhaps the spiritual soul. I promise, most of the arguments I'm going to talk about are not that ridiculous, but that's kind of what I've seen with a lot of the more hyperbolic reactions to The Acolyte. We can dismiss those offhand because, let's be frank, those are just not worth discussing. What am I going to do? Say, no, that's not true for however long this video is? No, that's ridiculous. Now, with my previous video discussing bad media criticism, I was given a lot of feedback, as I've noticed, and a lot of the feedback said I didn't go into specific examples enough. Well, this time I got you covered. On my last live stream, I went over several different reviews that I saw for The Acolyte. The full thing is still live on my channel for the VOD. However, the intention of this is I'm going to insert clips from that VOD into this to substantiate some of my discussions, to show examples of people saying the things I'm claiming, and my initial reactions to them when I first heard them.
People used to get excited at the prospect of new movies and TV shows.
So I think a while ago I made that video about bad faith criticism, and they always want to talk about the past. Remember how good look, there's fire in space right there! Look, it's right there! Remember how good Star Wars was when fire was in space? Yeah, there you go. There's your fire in space. It's right there, buddy. I guess a few things we should say before we really get started. And one of them is simply, what are my feelings on Star Wars as a whole? Well, the truth is, I've always liked Star Wars, but I've never been that kind of obsessive fan who regards it as one of the greatest works of science fiction. In fact, I probably wouldn't rank any Star Wars property in the top 20 science fiction works that I've consumed over the years. I just don't, or fantasy for that matter. I just don't think Star Wars is elevated in the same way that Dune or something like that would be elevated. It's not the Lord of the Rings of science fiction. It just simply is not. But it is entertaining, it is good, and it has a legacy that's impossible to understate. I also I think there's better science fiction out there right now. Like, for example, The Expanse, Ghost in the Shell, Neuromancer, Dune, again. Star Trek, also. Controversial opinion, I think Star Trek is more consistent than Star Wars. There you go. Decades and decades and decades of science fiction out there is so superior, I think. Apparently, though, a lot of people who talk about Star Wars online don't seem to enjoy talking about Star Wars. They spend a lot of time talking about how much they hate Star Wars, how much it makes them angry, how much they love George Lucas's original vision, but the modern Star Wars doesn't live up to that. And, listen, if you don't like Star Wars, just do anything else. Watch Star Trek. Watch Dune. Read a book. There's tons of science fiction novels out there.
A rich and detailed world we all wanted to know more about. Remember when it was still considered an icon of pop culture and not a sad, embarrassing train wreck being mercilessly milked to death by a gigantic, money-hungry corporation that never understood what made it special in the first place? Remember when it was still being worked on by creatives with genuine passion for the world they were adding to, instead of ridiculous, incompetent tourists and activists masquerading as filmmakers? Well, that brings me neatly along to The Acolyte, the latest excretion from Disney Lucasfilm, preparing to join the long line of failed projects that were all going to save Star Wars. This time coming from the creative mind of Harvey Weinstein's former personal assistant, Leslye Headland.
For a lot of fans, they cite Disney purchasing Lucasfilm as the big breaking point for Star Wars. And again, a lot of things did change. The old Legends canon was tossed out, we got a new trilogy of films and then some, whole new TV shows regularly released on Disney+. A lot of things have changed, and honestly, some of them have not been for the better. And I'll be the first to admit, I don't think everything Disney has made has been good. A lot of it is messy. But you also see a continuing trend among the discussion of any new Disney property. How does the new Disney thing compare to the old Star Wars thing. Is the old Legends canon better, or is it better? Really, there's no other. It's controversial to say that you like something from the Disney era more than something that occurred that was similar in the old Legends canon.
But over the last few years, there's been an increasing phenomenon of people trying to kind of weaponize Legends. Basically, there's a bunch of people who express being a Legends fan just as a way to say that the new canon sucks. And the thing is, they almost always get Legends completely wrong. If you like Legends and dislike canon, more power to you, and the same about the reverse. You do you. What I don't like is people trying to weaponize something I enjoy as a way to attack others for enjoying something else, especially when they seem to often have no idea what they're talking about. Just this week I've seen a few things circulating like these, and these are just a few, mostly identity protecting images because I don't want to encourage some other kind of backlash against them either. Among these claims about Legends are things like it being apolitical, despite, for example, the New Jedi Order being almost 24 books about not being shit to refugees, and about reaching cultural understanding, albeit in ways that very much reflect the time they were written in.
But The Acolyte has a benefit. It's taking place in a timeline that hasn't really been explored all that much in Legends canon. It's taking place in the High Republic era, a new era that Disney has kind of erected that's pre-Phantom Menace, but post the Old Republic.
So the time of the Old Republic goes from 20,000 years before the Battle of Yavin up until 1,000 years before the Battle of Yavin. The High Republic era occurred after all of that, when the Galactic Republic and the Jedi Order were both at their idealistic height, like the golden age of the galaxy. Again, according to the Timeline's reference book, that era started about 500 years after the end of the Sith Wars.
You still see people argue that this new canon contradicts the Legends canon, and nowhere is that more clear than when people start getting angry about Ki-Adi-Mundi. You know who Ki-Adi-Mundi is, right? He's that guy from the Phantom Menace with the big long head, the big towering head who's wrong about everything.
My only conclusion can be that it was a Sith Lord.
Impossible. The Sith have been extinct for a millennium. He is a political idealist, not a murderer.
They to all systems in the Republic, but have found no sign of General Grievous. What about the droid attack on the Wookiees?
That guy. Apparently, in Legends canon, he was cited as being born in 93 BBY, before the Battle of Yavin, for those who aren't plugged into Wikipedia like everyone else is. Ki-Adi-Mundi's age was established in the Star Wars Episode 1 Insider's Guide, as well as some trading cards, which was considered G-canon for a time, which means George Lucas level canon. Of course, George Lucas contradicted these things himself by changing Ki-Adi-Mundi's lightsaber in Attack of the Clones, but, you know, people don't talk about that too much, that George Lucas broke his own canon a lot. We'll get to that in a second. However, The Acolyte takes place in 132 BBY.
Not only is Ki-Adi-Mundi knowing about the dying of the Jedi being a major problem, but it's also the fact that he wasn't even born yet. That is, until Wikipedia went in real time during the live stream to quickly change the birth date of Ki-Adi-Mundi in the hopes that no one would notice. When even their own system said that this was an error, I found it to be quite interesting how they quickly added in his birth date. Site error, goddamn, they were quick to get on that one, eh? Look at that, boys.
Someone get in there! We have to update it to Leslye Headland's shit lore that she just created and manipulated. Ah!
But then you scroll down to the shit that they updated. Biography was born prior to 132 BBY. Huh? I don't understand. How was he born before 132 BBY? But here they say 93 BBY. Because they just manipulated the system because of a shitty show where the showrunner has no idea what Star Wars is. But
Well, let's hang on.
Thankfully, they left the Legends date. That just doesn't matter. Because whatever...
Yeah, because Legends is the canon where they establish his birth date. It's not in the current canon, so it was changed. That's how lore works.
Leslye Headland says now, it's canon. If he's not alive, make it happen. In fact, let's just add an extra 40 years. Anyway.
So, Ki-Adi-Mundi is now at least 40 years older than he previously was. Probably close to 50, 60, or 70. Which, some people have said the aliens have a lifespan of 50 years, but I'm guessing that's tossed out too. I don't care. What matters is Ki-Adi-Mundi is an experienced Jedi. What does it matter if he's born a few decades earlier? And frankly, who cares about Ki-Adi-Mundi? Like, really? This is the character you're going to bat for? This guy? The guy who cares about the attack on the Wookiees?
What about the droid attack on the Wookiees?
This is like when Admiral Akbar died in The Last Jedi, and all of a sudden, every single Admiral Akbar fan in the world came out of the woodwork to decry this decision made by a guy who was famous for the meme he represented before. it's not really something that matters all that much in the vast scheme of Star Wars continuity.
Isn't supposed to be born yet for another 39, 40 years. But hey, who cares? Let's just throw him in and change his info so that when he dies in Revenge of the Sith, he's more like 110 instead of 70, like what was originally established. All to just retract his line on the Phantom Menace. Because if he's here, it all makes sense then. He's the key to making this show plausible. But let me tell you guys something.
Well, again, this whole criticism depends on how the Acolyte fits into the prequels, right? I don't really care about that. I don't care if you could break the canon directly, I wouldn't care, as long as the show's good. Break canon if it's a good show. I don't care. But this became controversial. So controversial that when Wikipedia updated the current canon page of Ki-Adi-Mundi, mind you, the Legends page is not edited at all. It's the Disney canon era. They updated the date to reflect the new information, and they got lambasted by tons of people online who were angry at this change being made. Like, here's the thing. The Legends page is still there. You still have the old version of Ki-Adi-Mundi around. It's just now you have an alternate version that's currently being explored in current media. Yet this reaction was so overblown. Tons and tons of angry messages were sent to Wikipedia staff. And look, this isn't even the first time Disney has changed the characters in age. For example, Qui-Gon Jinn, his birth date was changed years ago in Disney canon, but no one really seemed to care or notice at that time, and I would make the argument that Qui-Gon Jinn was a far more noteworthy character than Ki-Adi-Mundi.
But it was a Sith Lord.
Impossible.
And the other thing, too, is that often people will argue that Disney's going against George Lucas's vision. This is George's story, and Disney is going in with their Mickey Mouse gloved hands and ruining it. Of course, this would imply that everything in Legends was George Lucas's vision, except no, it wasn't.
Legends was very much not an execution of George Lucas's ideas. Things couldn't be published if they significantly impacted something he planned to do, and he did have the ability to just say no to stuff being published, but he wasn't directing it, and over the years a lot of authors who thought George was involved in certain ideas that they were working on, they learned that that wasn't actually the case.
Star Wars lore has never been stable. If you ever go back and read the pre-prequels stories about the Clone Wars, it's vastly different than what we got in the films, ultimately. And this isn't uncommon. A lot of authors will do this. For example, Ursula K. Le Guin, the author of the Earthsea series, famously went back to her series 20 years after finishing her initial trilogy to create Tehanu, a book that completely revised the lore and standing of her characters and universe, because she approached it with a new lens, a new feminist lens that would have her reevaluate the old work. Because again, people's opinions about their own stories change over time.
It was very interesting to write, not an easy one. The way I handled it upset many of my older readers, particularly men, because they saw it as a feminist statement and were alarmed. They perceived it as kind of a betrayal because my hero Ged had lost his power, and a male hero who had lost his power was degraded in some people's eyes. It was a radical revision from within of my whole enterprise in writing, and for a while I wondered if it was going to silence me. But I think if I hadn't gone through with it and learned how to write from my own being as a woman, I probably would have stopped writing.
And George Lucas is no stranger to this. Consider this. George Lucas made a joke at around 2010 that Obi-Wan Kenobi came from the planet Stewjon, named after comedian Jon Stewart. He just, he came from Stewjon, whatever. And that became canon because George Lucas said it. But prior to this, in the Clone Wars character encyclopedia, it was stated that Obi-Wan Kenobi was born on Coruscant. But I mean, at least they didn't say Obi-Wan Kenobi was born 40 years earlier or something. Then Star Wars fans would flip out.
Impossible.
Actually, that would be a big contradiction, actually. Obi-Wan Kenobi is meant to be young in Phantom Menace, but again, that's where age matters. Does age really matter with Ki-Adi-Mundi? Does it matter that he's 40 years older? What does that really change? He's still an old guy who's a Jedi Master. He's an aged, learned figure. Does making him 40 years older change any of that? I would say no. In an old interview for Starlog, George Lucas claimed that he doesn't even read the Expanded Universe material. He stated, "I don't really read the stuff. I haven't read any of the novels, I don't know anything about that world. That's a different world than my world. But I do try to keep it consistent. So if I come up with a name or something, I look it up and see if it has already been used." Star Wars fans have always argued that any changes made to Legends canon is a contradiction of George's vision, but that's simply not true. Much of the Legends canon was made without him even knowing about it. He maybe signed off on it, but that's about it. He always would contradict it when it became inconvenient for his vision. And if you have any doubts, just ask Karen Traviss how her Mandalorian lore is doing after the Clone Wars animated series made numerous retcons to Mandalorian lore that contradicted what Karen Traviss had written. The problem is this: a lot of Star Wars criticism falls back on just regurgitating trivia about Star Wars, especially a continuity that no longer exists. It's been gone since 2012. Saying it was this way in Legends doesn't really matter. That's old news. It's gone already. Nothing except for the movies and the Clone Wars animated series has carried over. Everything else is gone. So let's move on from that. Yes, you can compare. Of course, compare. Please compare. That's what fans have to do. But saying this thing is different now isn't a criticism anymore. We know that already. This is like watching the Christopher Nolan Batman movies and saying, why isn't Batman using shark repellent? Or, I thought the Joker killed Batman's parent. What's this Joe Chill guy doing? If you said it in a comic book circle, you'd be laughed out. The best you can hope for is they think you're joking and they laugh with you, but really laughing at you. In Star Wars, though, saying the old continuity did this and it's different from the current continuity is considered a legitimate form of criticism. And I don't understand why that should matter. Because saying the story is bad because it didn't follow the old continuity to the letter, that's not really a good form of criticism. It's just a statement.
Leslye Headland says now, it's canon. If he's not alive, I'll make it happen. In fact, let's just add an extra 40 years. Anyways, the Jedi and
again, who cares? It's not that big a deal. It really doesn't matter how old the alien with the big elongated head is. But I rambled about this topic enough. Let's get back to The Acolyte.
Someone has trained her.
But who?
She doesn't know her master's identity.
In The Acolyte, Ki-Adi-Mundi is part of a collective of Jedi who conceal information from the High Council and the Senate regarding an enigmatic Force user.
We must alert the High Council.
The High Council would be obliged to inform the Senate. A scandal like this would inspire fear and mistrust. We should handle this ourselves.
This person turns out to be a Sith, but they don't know that at the time. Or maybe the precursors to the Knights of Ren, judging from that theme music that plays whenever he shows up. Or maybe it's both. Maybe he's a witch, who knows. What matters to the show and the continuity at large is that the small council of Jedi conclude it must be a dark Jedi, a fallen Jedi, or something like that. Now, what's interesting about this is an example of something we see in The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, that the Jedi are becoming complacent with their position of power and ignore threats to it.
He is a political idealist, not a murderer.
They see their authority as superior to government bodies, which does eventually lead to some dissent among the other senators when it comes time to restructure as the First Galactic Empire.
And the Jedi Rebellion has been foiled.
What's happened?
The Chancellor's been elaborating on a plot by the Jedi.
Ki-Adi-Mundi represents this across all of the prequel. He is always a voice of ignorance. He ignores that the Sith could ever exist in modern day. He dismisses the idea that Count Dooku is a threat. And when confronted with some meaningful issues, he talks about the droid attack on the Wookiees. He exists as a representative of the complacency of the Jedi in the lore of the prequels. He is not a hero. He is not really all that good of a character. He is simply a figurehead to say the Jedi are complacent. So him doing what he does in The Acolyte is totally in character. He dismisses a threat because the Jedi are all powerful. He doesn't seem to actually register anything, and he learns from those above him. Those before him showed, hey, let's keep this a secret because we're going to handle it internally. Further, the prequels establish something important. While in the original trilogy the Jedi are seen as a great force of good, in the prequels we see the Jedi were kind of complacent, like I said. But they also did a lot of bad things. I mean, take for example, they take children and groom them into soldiers.
They want to take our children!
The Jedi do not take children.
Yeah, I know they say they don't take children, but they take children. And I think the show's exploring that with the character of Sol and his relationship with Osha and May. But again, that's a different discussion. We'll get to that later. I mean, you take kids and recruit them to join a cult. That's kind of cult-like, isn't it?
The May targeted these 3.
4. Including you, Sol. The 4 Jedi stationed on her home planet when she was a child. She turns up all these years later, trained by one of our own.
You think a Jedi taught her?
Even a hologram can tell me that.
The Jedi at this point seem convinced their enemy is a rogue Jedi. or from some dark faction of the Dathomir witches. It never comes up that the enemy is a Sith until episode 5, and quite frankly, the people who heard the word Sith, they're not going to live to the end of the show. Let's just be blunt. I mean, most of them already gone. Oh, by the way, spoiler alert for everything in The Acolyte. We're going to get into spoilers up until episode 6 in this video. I will leave an update if he survives to episode 6, because I'm filming this after episode 5, but I don't know if Soul's going to live to the end of the series to tell anyone that a Sith is back. Because everyone else who heard the word Sith, who met this guy, is now gone. So, there's not many other options left to reveal to the Jedi that the Sith are still around.
She exposed me. So now I have to kill every single last one of you.
So as far as the characters know, the enemy is not a Sith. So Ki-Adi-Mundi, he's in the clear right now. He's okay. Stop breaking any bylines. That's good. Wait till he finds out that Count Dooku isn't exactly a friendly guy either in the later films, so we'll go from there.
I don't make the rules. The Jedi do. And the Jedi say I can't exist.
Impossible. The Sith have been extinct for a millennium.
Basically, the rule of thumb is this. If Ki-Adi-Mundi tells you something, he's probably wrong. That's just his point of his character at this point. Or to worry about the droid attack on the Wookiees, one of the two. The Sith are a specific order, with only a master and an apprentice. And that line ends with Vader and Palpatine. That means Kylo Ren and Knights of Ren, they're not Sith. The witches, not Sith. So far, nothing in the lore is contradicted if we count all canonical material that has informed the Jedi of their own conclusions. We know the Sith exist, regardless of what the Jedi think, but it's what the Jedi believe that matters more than anything else. For those of you wondering why the Jedi couldn't sense, like, the Sith right in front of them when they encountered him multiple times, well, consider all the times they were hanging out with Palpatine and couldn't tell he was a Sith. The crux of many criticisms of The Acolyte are how it impacts the greater Star Wars narrative. It treats this piece, which again is vastly removed from the main canon by several decades, as just a cog in the greater machine, rather than a work of media on its own. And that's what I really want to explore with this video. Because the hate for this show isn't simply just, this show is bad. It's that this show makes Star Wars as a whole worse. So for the rest of this video, let's talk about that response, both pre-release and during release.
What can we expect from the creative powerhouse of Leslye Headland? Well, I'll be fucked if I know, because the trailer is less of a primer for The Acolyte and more like a series of disconnected scenes carefully chosen to tell us nothing at all. I mean, I definitely had fun playing a particularly challenging game of Spot the White Guy with this trailer, because damn man, this one shows enough to fulfill Disney's entire DEI quota for the next 2 fiscal years. For example, check out this collection of Jedi Padawans and see if you can identify the one demographic that's mysteriously left out.
Okay, this is what I wanted to really focus on. This one image got a lot of traction online, both from people who don't like The Acolyte and people who do like The Acolyte. So everyone got traction out of this. As he mentions in his first episode review.
I mean, given that he's an alien, I'd have to assume as well that his description of the suspect would probably have boiled down to a young black human female with her hair in braids. Now, in a galaxy composed of thousands of colonized planets, there'd have to be literally billions of people who fit that description.
There's going to be a lot of black people in Star Wars' universe. There's going to be a lot of aliens. A lot of white guys too, but we already know they exist. So, who cares? I'm not arguing that it's necessarily always wrong to say, hey, this is kind of tokenism. But this is very tokenizing, this one shot. And if your core argument is that there's not enough white people in one shot of Star Wars, and that's going to be the core thing your argument depends on, we have problems. It's not going to work out. Your argument is already based on a very faulty line of logic.
Anyway, as best as I could piece together from various interviews and whatever tidbits of information the trailer gave us, the general gist is that the show takes place in a time of peace and prosperity for the High Republic, with the Jedi presiding over a galaxy of order and happiness, because Leslye Headland thought it would be interesting to make Star Wars with no war in it. Superb choice there.
I mean, that's what the Phantom Menace did. It's a time of peace, and then the Trade Federation messes things up. And they're peacekeepers, but there's no war going on. So it's a blockade, and there's one battle at the end. It's not a war, it's a military conflict. The Acolyte had received hate for months leading up to its release, as many people very well know. Primarily, these criticisms can be broken down into one of three categories: complaining about Disney Star Wars, complaining about diversity in the Star Wars universe, or complaining about showrunner Leslye Headland and how she worked previously with Harvey Weinstein. Now, I'm not going to excuse that whatsoever. Obviously, as personal assistant to Harvey Weinstein, she had access to information that none of us did. None of this should be taken as an endorsement of anything Headland might have done while with Weinstein. I just find it kind of funny how we're exclusively holding her accountable when all of Hollywood knew about Harvey Weinstein. Headland was Harvey Weinstein's personal assistant for about 1 year at minimum. It's hard to really tell because they're contradictory accounts online. And you know what? I'm not going to endorse that. I just think we should criticize everyone who's had involvement with Harvey Weinstein, but if I did that, we'd be here all day. Harvey Weinstein's sins were so well known, they were making jokes about it when they gave Shrek an Academy Award.
Gosh, up until now I thought Monsters Incorporated was a documentary on the Weinsteins. But,
Anyway, let's take a step back and focus on Disney Star Wars and diversity, because there's a conversation to be had here. It's a paradox how fans seem to simultaneously hate the Disney canon and yet feel determined to push back against any perceived contradiction it presents. Leslye Headland has stated outright that she wanted to incorporate different elements of the EU material into The Acolyte, and was able to do so.
For a long period of time, I'm not going to age myself, but the extended universe and a lot of that publishing was really the only Star Wars that I had. And so what I love about the High Republic is that it's kind of in the grand tradition of what Star Wars was for the fans for a really long time, which is, both these kind of high concept, beautifully rendered stories, but at the same time, pulpy action, and the kind of stuff that we always love and adore about Star Wars in the live action. So I wanted to have the opportunity to bring both of those things together.
One interesting component from the EU that they brought in,
Trikata was a form of lightsaber combat developed for taking advantage of a lightsaber's ability to be turned on and off. There are 3 main moves or maneuvers which typically are labeled as Trikata, the first of which was known as Pass the Blade. The duelist would deactivate their blade as they attack, bypassing the opponent's block before igniting it into the helpless foe. Flash Slash. This was the activation of the duelist's blade for only a moment, allowing just enough time for the blade to reach full length while being swung, and then deactivate it again. There are only 6 known uses of Trikata as of now within canon and legends. Jedi Master Ko Sin Darch employed this or a similar technique to great effect during his fight with the Sith Lord Vindican and his apprentice Malgus. Members of the New Jedi Order were known to employ Trikata techniques, such as Jedi Master Mara Jade Skywalker.
Kind of a cool technique, right? Here until unused fighting style of lightsaber fights incorporated into the series, and one of the coolest fight scenes in the show. But we'll get to that later. We'll get to the Sith equivalent of Jason Voorhees in a bit. She seems also to have held the Old Republic in high regard, which is a great sign because the Old Republic is probably the best thing in Star Wars, right next to Andor, by a mile. I think Old Republic and Andor, way above everything else. That's like my kind of sci-fi. I love that stuff.
It's just whatever. It's honestly a kind of a forgettable show.
I yearned to be a savior against injustice without contemplating the cost, and by the time I looked down, there was no longer any ground beneath my feet.
Look, acting was great. Cinematography was great. The writing was good.
The dead lifted me with their truth, and now I'm dead, and I yearn to lift you.
But it was a lot of little things. I mean, when we saw the camera in the previous episode, there were like screws in the wall. When we see certain architecture, it's just bricks. It's not smooth stone or sandstone or whatever it might be that was in the prequels or the originals, which kind of gives you the feel of Star Wars. The whole thing about Star Wars is to feel like it's from a galaxy far, far away. It didn't do that.
But again, I digress. Most criticisms of Leslye Headland, when it isn't talking about her ties with Weinstein, focus on her being self-centered, about her perspective.
And despite absolutely nothing happening in this episode, Leslye Headland wouldn't want to miss an opportunity to once again take George Lucas's lore to Harvey's couch.
If you want another fun little game for yourself, then look up pretty much any interview of Headland talking about this show, and I can pretty much guarantee that 90% of it will be her talking about her favourite subject in the entire world, herself. How important this story was to her, how it made her feel to be represented, why her characters from a fanfic written decades ago somehow find themselves in a $100 million TV show because they mattered to her.
Is that when I pitched it, because I came in and I pitched my own idea, but I would have been able to understand as a queer person, and I think I would have had a completely different life. It was like, I was like, what I'm really interested in is,
But it is always, always, always about the spiritual journey of what it is to become who you are.
This show has all the hallmarks.
That's not even talking about herself. That's just saying focusing on your individual journey is important. None of those are particularly offensive statements. Saying my perspective when making something was this isn't that drastic of a thing. You watch a lot of interviews with creatives, they'll use that same language because they want to emphasize it's my perspective and here's where my perspective came in. Which, most storytellers write from their perspectives. Who tells their stories when they're not centered on themselves in some way? Yes, you can argue they remove themselves from the equation, but, the phrase write what you know is it's a good advice for a reason. It's good to write what you know. Would you be more interested in a story from someone who has no personal involvement in its narration, no investment, no sense of viewpoint? Again, Luke Skywalker is just Luke S. He just took the A out and made a word with the S. It's all self-insertion.
These are the people in charge of Star Wars now, and I think it's about time that we accepted it's not going to change, ever. Disney are never going to give this franchise up, and they're never going to do any better because, quite simply, they can't. And George Lucas isn't coming back riding atop a white horse to save the day.
But of course, the big thing is that Leslye Headland is a queer woman and brought her queer experience to Star Wars. That's what they really are upset about when they talk about Headland drawing from her own life experience and perspective. They're really upset that you're getting gay people in Star Wars. And listen, diversity has become a big topic in media discussion. It's no secret that The Acolyte is a very diverse show. There's a lower number of white male characters in The Acolyte than in previous shows. I just don't think that matters whatsoever. It shouldn't matter. The galaxy is a huge place. Of course there's different people there. I think it's interesting that The Acolyte has about as many white people as the original Star Wars had black people. It's just the same concept. It's just as likely, so who cares? The cast is primarily consistent of people of color. The lead of the show, Amandla Stenberg, is a non-binary person of color. Lee Jung-jae, who plays Master Soul, learned English just to play this role. And yes, he was in Squid Games. Everyone seems to call him the guy from Squid Games, and no one seems to say his actual name.
Then Jedi Master Nepo spends the rest of the scene trying to figure out what the hell Jedi Master Soul is saying.
His objective is not solely her own.
Wait a second, hang on. He's just making fun of his accent. The problem is he starts off saying that people aren't being racist, and then makes fun of a man's natural accent, so,
And apparently, the Critical Drinker and yours truly, through our reviews of a poorly written streaming show, are fostering hatred and bigotry.
But that's not to say there aren't any white people in the cast. Obviously, Daphne Keane, who played X-23 in Logan, plays a Padawan. Carrie-Anne Moss, Trinity herself, is a Jedi Master who gets knifed to the chest.
And then she eventually dies to the assassin because the assassin throws a knife at the bartender and the Jedi Master force stops it, and then she takes a knife in the heart while she was distracted for stopping it. So she acted to protect the bartender far more than she acted to protect any of the friends she was with, and it led to her death.
Yeah,
she died to basically a small fucking kitchen knife blade. Of course, it's very sharp. It's a real weapon, but I mean, it's a Jedi Master. You don't typically expect them to die to something like that. That was pretty underwhelming. But the fight itself was flashy and cool, but when you really start to break apart why it was happening and the way in which the Jedi died here, kind of silly.
Shortly before the show came out, controversy arose because of the appearance of some queer characters. The series features witches, the Sisters of Dathomir.
I thought the last week took the cake for the most lore-breaking cringe that I've ever seen in Star Wars.
The witches conceived of the protagonists of the show, twins Mai and Osha Anisea. So 2 women would conceive of life using the Force. Now, we know this is possible because Anakin was clearly also conceived using the Force. However, rather than see this as an interesting precursor to Anakin's birth, fans went nuts over this.
Well, Chancellor, that reminds me of this one story the Jedi told me about. There were these witches, you see, and they were able to create life. But not just once, twice. They were so powerful, much like this Darth Plagueis, but they were actually successful. They created Force-sensitive beings. You could say they were the first before me. They were the real chose. They were the...
What?
They were my sisters. The Force created them, and Force created me. I mean, I don't remember Master ever telling me these... I mean...
Now, the reason why they went nuts is apparently this diminishes the value of Anakin if someone else was born this way previously. Which begs the question, do you think Anakin was the first person ever conceived the Force? There's a prophecy for a reason. They knew it was possible. In episode 3, we hear Palpatine tell the story of Darth Plagueis the Wise. And he outright says that Plagueis could manipulate the midichlorians to create life. Why would we assume he was the first one to do that? And why would we assume he didn't learn it from somewhere? Again, the Legends canon says one thing, but we know that's out of the picture. Don't worry about that too much now. Also, at one point, Osha hints that the gerbil alien might use they pronouns.
And this brings us to the most poignant scene in all of The Acolyte, the use of pronouns in live-action Disney Star Wars.
Is he or they with us?
And the rest of the 27...
You're talking about the gerbil. You're talking about an alien gerbil. Who cares? Here's the thing, also about the gerbil, right? Whose name I am not going to look up because I don't care. It's an alien gerbil. It's a little guy, a little silly guy. Hey, who the hell knows what it is? You know, not knowing what gender the gerbil is. That's a big sticking point apparently because pronouns. And this, of course, ignores how in real life, several animal species have more than 2 sexes. Researchers often claim fungi, for example, possesses dozens, if not thousands, of different separate sexes. So the idea of an alien species that's not like people, not strictly falling under male or female sexual identities, that's not too unusual. Like, it's nothing worth getting upset over, that the alien may not be a boy or a girl. But yeah, videos were coming out long before The Acolyte released, demonizing the show for featuring queer characters.
They completely redefine what the Force is. And
Look
you're
at
gonna
Ryan.
see
Ryan's ready to explode. Like,
you're gonna
Ryan's-
see 2 mothers conceive twins. A bunch of witches that are and basically the Jedi turn into cops.
Jedi business. Go back to your drinks.
Episode 1 and 2, whatever. You know, it's fine. 3 and 4, and get ready for pronouns in Star Wars.
Oh, no.
And when the show came out, well, look, okay, I guess it's time for me to actually talk about what I think about The Acolyte. If you've gotten up to this point, you probably think, oh, I must love the show. Enthusiastic supporter. Not really. I think the show has gotten better with each episode. The first 2 episodes, I was like, okay, I'm interested, but I'm not really sold yet. Episode 3 introduced the backstory, in which case you can see the seeds of the real mystery coming through. Episode 4, more interested. Episode 5 is, though, where I'm like fully on board. Episode 5 really is where the show kicks it into high gear. Now, the show has tons of problems. The sets, very artificial looking. The script, sometimes a little stiff. The characters, not all that dynamic. Some are very simple on the surface. I want to get back to that later because I'm sure a lot of hidden details are below the surface, especially with Soul. But it's not like the show is necessarily the greatest thing of all time. It's not Andor. It's not the first 2 seasons of The Mandalorian. I think Ahsoka might even be a little higher. But so the show is okay. It's nothing, I don't think it's anything egregious. I just think it's a show. It's all right, whatever. At the same time, though, you can see where the show is setting up mystery. And that's what really will determine the show's final placement in rankings, in my opinion, when the show ends. Because a mystery like this it lives or dies by its ending. If the ending is good, everything before that is made retroactively better. If the ending is bad, it sucks the soul out of everything that came before it. So, I'm reserving judgment till the end, but so far, it's all right. It's okay. Episode 5 is great, though.
She was a child.
You brought her here.
And yeah, it's explored the Force in ways that are interesting. It's explored the lives of the quote-unquote villains of Star Wars in a way that's interesting. It is an era without war, and thus we're seeing the undercurrents of what peace can do. We're seeing the precursors to what leads to the wars in Star Wars, and we're doing it in a way that adds sympathy to those who walked the path to the dark side. But when the first episode came out, the only thing the fandom was talking about was that there was a fire in space. Many fans cite this as a scientific impossibility, and it is, but it's Star Wars. You can't hear sounds in space either. And there's been fire repeatedly throughout the series thus far. Like, sustained flames. Yes, there's explosions too, but even some of the explosions you can see sustained flames sprouting up. Look, there's fire in space right there! So, yeah, it's silly, but it's Star Wars. Everything in Star Wars is silly. This is not a movie you come to for realistic science fiction. Science breaks down in this world. Now, I admit again, when watching the first few episodes of The Acolyte, I wasn't really hooked yet. I was watching it because I knew it was going to build to something, but I wasn't there yet. The third and fourth episode do a good job, I think, of investing you in this part of the world more, especially with the Dathomir witches. I also understand that people are upset by this. They say that it's breaking the lore in some way.
That's right. Witches, Chancellor.
What? 2?
They died in a fire. Bricks.
But the problem with how I watched the show initially was that I thought the mystery was who was killing the Jedi. But that's not what's happening. The mystery isn't who's killing the Jedi. The mystery is why the Jedi are being killed. And further, after that, the mystery becomes, what are the Jedi hiding from our protagonists? The question isn't who the mysterious Sith is. It's not who's committing these murders. The mystery really is, what is Soul hiding? What are the Jedi doing to maintain order in the galaxy that puts those on the outskirts into a position that's dangerous? And that's, I think, where Headland's lived experience really is effective. It shows sympathy for those who are marginalized in order to illustrate how mainstream society, even when it is trying to do good, can sometimes hurt and ostracize those outside of the accepted standards.
We were hunted, persecuted, forced into hiding, all because some would consider our power dark.
What do you want?
Freedom. The freedom to wield my power the way I like, without having to answer to Jedi like you.
I mean, it's pretty clear from the prequels that the Jedi are not really doing the best of jobs. Their arrogance allows Palpatine to overtake everything. They're standing in the room with Palpatine and can't tell he's a Sith. They're either inefficient or they're arrogant, and both of those are flaws.
The Jedi are romanticized, deified. But if you strip away the myth and look at their deeds, the legacy of the Jedi is failure, hypocrisy, hubris.
We should handle this ourselves.
Impossible. The Sith have been extinct for a millennium.
The Jedi like you might call me Sith.
The Jedi are doing some underhanded stuff in this show, which is interesting.
They want to take our children!
The Jedi do not take children.
Hold your tongue!
Despite the Jedi being peacekeepers, they are not necessarily always on the right side of the law.
I should have known the Jedi were plotting to take over.
We should handle this ourselves.
From my point of view, the Jedi are evil.
The Jedi do not take children.
The legacy of the Jedi is failure.
And while that's controversial, it's informed by the events of the prequels. Now, a big criticism are the Space Witch characters, the Night Sisters, the Witches of Dathomir, or at least their precursors. They're an ancient clan of force-wielding women, one of which has existed for a while, all the way back to Kevin J. Anderson's Young Jedi Knights novels. So they're established. Even before the Clone Wars, they've been established. But at this point in the show, they're a dying culture. And we see the Dathomir witches return in Ahsoka, so they're still relevant throughout the Disney era of Star Wars. Now, one thing that's interesting is that Star Wars has always been Jedi-centric. We've never seen really the first-person perspectives of the witches when either they're not in conflict with the Jedi or what? Like, why would anyone become a witch? What would this society, how would it function? We see them at war with the Jedi, but we don't really see enough of them just kind of existing on their own. This show is exploring that in a way that's interesting, showing them as outcasts, and that's kind of neat. A lot of fans don't like that, though, because it forces them to reevaluate how they perceive the Force.
I said, may the thread be with you. They completely redefine what the Force is.
Jedi and Sith wield the Ashlar and Bogan, the light and the dark.
I'm the one in the middle, the Bendu.
We were hunted, persecuted, forced into hiding, all because some would consider our power dark.
An object cannot make you good or evil.
That Force does not belong to the Jedi. To say that if the Jedi die, the light dies is vanity. Can you feel that?
Because, like world religions, not everyone can see the same events from the same perspective. What a Catholic may interpret as their faith, a Protestant may disagree. It's the same mentality here. The witches, the Sith, and the Jedi are all seeing the same basic idea, but their particular lens allows them to see it through a different way. And that's interesting. You don't have to agree with how they see it. Like, the thread may not be the way you interpret the Force, but given over the years how they've shown the Force is far more complex than the mere way the Jedi see it, it's not impossible to imagine that another order may reinterpret the Force in a way that's distinct. In the Clone Wars show especially, we really explore how the Force is a little bigger than even the Jedi seem to understand. And that was well received back in the day. This is doing the same basic thing, but in a much smaller, more personal scale.
That's the least of this scene's problems, because apparently there's a deleted scene out there where, after saying that the Sith have been extinct for a millennium, he follows that up with, except for that time we ran across a coven of lesbian space witches where two of them managed to conceive twin daughters without a father, who incidentally didn't look anything like their mother. I mean, where are the horns? But they were created by this thing called the Thread. So that really Dark Lord-looking dude
That's not the Sith, though. The witches are not Sith. They established that. In fact, the word Sith has not been stated once in the show so far. So anyone who says, like, oh, the Sith have been seen for 1,000 years. What about the time a few decades before? It's like, well, it's because they're not the Sith. At least the Jedi don't think they're the Sith. So that's what matters right there. The Acolyte has taken time to focus on this untapped component of Star Wars lore in a way that's really interesting. But the reaction from fans shows they're not really interested in reevaluating the Force. They want it to be part of this established lore. Because they see it as, if they break away from what the Jedi have said, it's lore breaking, when in actuality, it's just another point of view.
So what I told you was true, from a certain point of view.
From a certain point of view, the Force functions like the threads. But from another point of view, it functions like how the Jedi say it does. And they're both valid, because they're different groups using the Force in different ways. And clearly, we are looking at even the events in the show at this point from a very limited perspective, because it's clear there are many secrets that we have not been told yet as an audience, at least as of episode 5. This is also why I don't seem to mind the whole Force creating life thing, because we're never told definitively it's only been done this way. Because, quite frankly, the scope of the characters is very limited. Palpatine didn't see this, as far as we know. We didn't see, the Jedi, Yoda didn't see this, Mace Windu didn't see this, so why wouldn't the witches be able to do something forbidden and secret? Probably learning from someone else deeper in the lore than they did. There's no reason to believe Anakin is the first person to have ever been conceived of the Force. He's only the first person to have been conceived by the Force that the Jedi in the Phantom Menace are aware of, and that's a very specific time frame. After all, how did Palpatine and Plagueis figure it out? They read a book probably, went to an old library, talked to someone, who knows? But they figured it out from something that exists before them. And the deeper in Star Wars lore you go, the more likely you're going to see unusual, strange things that inform the actions of the current modern day of Star Wars. Further, the miracle of Anakin's birth is that it's seemingly immaculate. In this particular case with Osha and May, it's clear who manipulated the Force. We have two mothers. We know exactly who did it. So there's much less mystery behind Osha and May's birth, as opposed to with Anakin's birth, where it's just seen as the midichlorians themselves bringing life forth. To recap this tangent, there's no reason to believe the Force hasn't conceived life before, just that the Jedi haven't heard of it. And the Jedi, as we can tell, are not omniscient, nor do they understand every facet of the Force, as we've seen since Episode 1, where they were in the room with a Sith Lord and didn't know he was a Sith Lord. These guys aren't brilliant, or, Ki-Adi-Mundi, who gets everything wrong.
May gets tired and takes a break, then realizes that she doesn't want to kill the Jedi anymore, and her allegiance lies with her sister. Fair enough, she just trained about 17 years to kill the Jedi and seek revenge on them and avenge her sister, but yeah, you know what? She's just kind of tired now, so she's going to take a stop and, switch plans.
Why are people so... Okay, here's what I don't understand with all these responses with this. She only trained that way to avenge her sister. If she's not avenging anyone, why would she bother doing it? I don't get... I feel like they don't understand it. I mean, it's weird, right? Like, it's weird that they're saying, hey, why would you give up all that training after you spent years training? Well, because there's no point anymore. She's not avenging anyone anymore. Her sister's alive. She fought to defend her sister. Sister's okay. So, who cares? There's nothing to fight for anymore. Of course her entire worldview will change. That's the only reason that it matters to her. Now, again, the characters are stock. There's a lot of cliches. Not everything is perfect. And that deserves to be criticized. For the first 4 episodes, it's meandering. It's building a premise. It's building an establishment. You get comfortable. You get relaxed. And then episode 5 happens. The one good thing about Star Wars TV under Disney is that they have one thing they're consistently good-ish at, and that's making bad guys. Not every single one's a banger, but they've been some pretty good bad guys on these Star Wars TV shows. From the petty bureaucratic evils of the Imperials and Andor, to the megalomania of Moff Gideon in The Mandalorian, to the understated pathos of Balin's skull from Ahsoka, the villains are consistently some of the best parts of these shows. The only exception is Book of Boba Fett, which I think is by far the worst entry in the entire Disney catalog of work so far. I think Boba Fett is... This show is a waste of time, and the only time it gets decent is when it becomes someone else's show for 2 episodes. It's just awful. And again, there's no real central bad guy, just a rotating list of bad guys who show up for an episode or 2 and then leave or get killed off. But The Acolyte kicks it into high gear halfway through by introducing the guy who's going to wreck shop with every single person. Now, the Sith has been teased over the course of the show. Everyone remarking that it has to be some rogue Jedi or someone like that. And no one ever expected it. Well, let me rephrase that. No one in the show ever suspected it was wimpy Ezra Miller.
3 to the 5s and 10s of people who are actually interested in the show is, who is Smilo Ren? Is it Asian Ezra Miller? It could be, but I'm leaning towards something like this.
Didn't know it was me.
This, of course, fits with the theme of the series, that what you at first perceive to be truth is actually just a veneer, a mask. This goes a long way to excusing some of the stock characters, because clearly they're established as what you expect the Jedi to be. And it goes throughout the whole show. There's the one guy with the hair. He presents himself as this tough, powerful Jedi who's strong and aware, and he's always wrong. And he gets flattened without even being hit with a lightsaber. That's meant to show to us, the audience, that what we're told is not always what is. The guy holds his lightsaber around like a flashlight. He's clearly inexperienced with it. People think Osha is the killer at first. But then it turns out she has a secret twin, who everyone thought was dead, except she's not. Sol at first seems to be this mature, wise leader, until, and I think a lot of people figured this out from the very first second he showed up, he's hiding something. He has a facade of nobility that conceals his darker past. And maybe he feels guilty about it, but not guilty enough to confess to it, or take accountability for it, or face the consequences for it. And then he faces off against this wimpy, sniveling little guy who turns out to be the Sith equivalent of Jason Voorhees. He comes in like he's the Undertaker and just bodies these guys. And again, with this show, it's settled into a procedural pace at this point. We are shown, okay, here's the mystery, going to a new location, gonna find out this thing, and then it takes you completely off guard with one of the best fight scenes in Disney Star Wars. It goes from calm and collected to the ground is upended, what are we even doing now? 80% of this cast is dead. They're all dead. They killed them all off one by one, and we're left with an uncertain future. You know, in a lot of ways it reminds me of the opening of Ahsoka. The first half of Ahsoka is kind of meandering. A lot of people couldn't engage with it. They're introducing these characters. You're kind of going, okay, where are we going with this? If you didn't watch Rebels recently, you kind of lost. But then there's the fight between Ahsoka and Baylan. And when that happens, the show goes from just this kind of meandering, I don't know about this, to a show with pathos and cool stuff going on.
Your legacy, like your master's, is one of death and destruction.
You're invested. Now, granted, the show itself has flaws. I think the lightsaber fights in Ahsoka are lame, and I don't get how this was filmed right alongside this fight scene stuff, and they didn't take notes or trade ideas or get the same choreographer. It's staggering to me that Ahsoka's fights are so stiff when this fight, this 20-minute battle, is so fluid and consistently exciting. Where was that from Ahsoka? Like, Dave Filoni, get on this. But it's ironic, though, isn't it? If you look at what fans have wanted over the years, they want a cool fight scene. They want the Jedi being awesome. They want a bad guy who feels like a beast. And you get that. You get all of that right here. It's all here. And it's amazing how lukewarm the response has been from the people who've hated this show up until now. Yes, there are some people who are saying, that was a good episode. I'll give them credit. And you know what? If you're saying that, more power to you. I'm glad you're able to admit, even if you don't like a show overall, that you like that thing. But we're getting the best fighting since Darth Maul and the Phantom Menace. This is some cool stuff, and I'm hoping it keeps the pace.
Says here, the Acolyte strives to top that iconic Phantom Menace duel. I'm going to tell you something before I start to read this. This is like... We know, the majority of us know that this show is going to tank, okay? It most likely is, okay? You ever had an experience where you saw a really, really bad movie, but they had one cool scene in it? That's what this will be like. If you expect to top the duels in the previous movies, but you're still serving up woke garbage, it's not gonna matter. It's not. People will say in the future, the show was trash, but that one lightsaber, that was off the chain. They went deep with that one. Hey, if the rest of the show was as good as that lightsaber duel, they would have had a hit.
And I want to be fair. There are critics of the show who have given the show props when they feel it deserves props. Very noteworthy, Star Wars Theory, a major critic of the show, seemed almost satisfied with the first couple of episodes, with minor criticisms throughout, of course, but he overall seemed more warm on it. The Dathomir Witches came along and he kind of changed his tune, but it's important to note that not every critic is in unanimous agreement of what the flaws of The Acolyte are, nor are they completely unified on where the show's going.
The fights. I actually liked the fights. It's flashy, hand-to-hand combat, martial arts, and that's nice. There's not a lot of it, but when it's there, it's at least refreshing. It's this welcomed palate cleanser from the very terrible writing that the show has. Like, I don't even think the characters are even bad per se. Like, they could have been pretty interesting, but the writing is so cringe. And I know I use that word real loosey-goosey. I mainly use it ironically, but here I really do mean it. It sounds like they're trying to be deep, but don't know how. For example, one of the bad guys, he's like, steel and laser no good against Jedi. have to kill the dream, and then fucking fires up his lightsaber for no reason, all to be like really cinematic and dramatic. It's just really lame. Like, all of the writing falls super flat. Even when you have characters I think could work pretty well, they just can't write them well, unfortunately.
I was kind of getting into this one a little bit. This is actually like a well-articulated review. I want to emphasize that right now. This is the kind of negative review I'd want to see more of. You're talking about the writing. You're talking about, hey, this seems out of character. The characters have potential, but they're not well written. I don't agree with what he's saying necessarily, but at least he's saying it in a way that's compelling and, like, reasonable. Like, it's not, like, rage baity. It's more like, okay. So, when I talk about these criticisms, they're in general statements. They're not really every single person. This doesn't apply to every single person. But the problem is people are so quick to judge a show based on pieces, episode by episode, that we want to come to a conclusive statement immediately. People are looking at it episode by episode and they're not taking the complete package as a whole. It's because the knee-jerk reaction has to exist. We have to react to every new piece of information immediately, rather than wait for things to naturally develop and occur. But more odd than that is how people are taking The Acolyte not as an individual show, but as a piece of Star Wars lore. Few people are reacting to the show on its own. Most of the criticisms involve how it affects the greater lore of Star Wars, how it affects the legacy of Star Wars. The Dathomir Witches episode wasn't taken as kind of a red herring and a mystery. It was taken as lore breaking to Star Wars, because that's more important than the individual show itself to its critics. And there's things you can criticize. The acting, the sets, the lighting, all of that. Those are things that are individual to The Acolyte that are worth criticizing. And I'm not going to argue with you on that. If you don't like the acting, that's you. You know, that's your opinion. The problem is, most of the criticisms exist solely to reference how The Acolyte pieced together with Star Wars lore. And of course, yeah, it's part of Star Wars lore. That's part of the criticism. But it seems to me that it becomes an all-encompassing element of criticism. We're not really talking about the critical elements of the show beyond that. It becomes purely about how it affects the rest of Star Wars. Because, quite frankly, a lot of these critics don't really care about The Acolyte. But they do care about Star Wars. And that's how they frame the review.
Tell you something fast.
I don't want to hear him rap. I can tell. Oh, wow. The most replayed is after he stops rapping. I love that.
If you've heard this one before, the same company that thanked a concentration camp in China for Mulan covered up Chadwick Boseman's face on the Black Panther poster for China, shrunk Finn on the Force Awakens poster.
What does any of this have to do with The Acolyte? What does anything about this have to do with The Acolyte? Yeah. No one's going to say Disney's a great company. Disney's a terrible company. They do a lot of awful things. What does this have to do with the show specifically? You're talking about decisions made by marketing people who are paid a salary by Disney's CEO, and you're saying that somehow conflates with the creative process of a show made. Creative and marketing are two different divisions in the company, specifically overall brand marketing for their films and their TV division. So, by your own logic, this makes no sense. A corporation isn't just one monolith, it's several smaller teams that work collectively for the whole. Comparing what the marketing team did for a Chinese release, so an international marketing team, versus the creative team for The Acolyte, especially specifically the actors. Do you think Amanda Steinberg was involved with the marketing team for a movie that was made 5 years before her? No. Oh, sorry. 10 years before she joined Disney? No, forget about it.
For China, a company well known for providing the discourse and gaslighting what's left of the divided fan.
So, wait a second. He's saying China is responsible for Ewan McGregor, Ryan Johnson, and Pablo Hidalgo? Who's Pablo Hidalgo? What's the connection here? But again, the problem is, of this video, 5 minutes we're talking about The Acolyte. The other 7 were making jokes or talking about Disney as a corporation. So it's not really... And even then, your points were never about this show. It was about, Disney 10 years ago did this. What does that have to do with The Acolyte? Which I think is a pretty weird way of looking at a review. Typically speaking, when you watch a show, you talk about the show. You don't talk about how it affects other shows that haven't been made yet, or past movies. Even in franchises like the MCU, a lot of critics focus their criticisms on just the movie itself And then they'll talk about the teases for the other movies. Yeah, that's a thing. That's an element. But the movie itself, the show itself, how does that work? Star Wars seems unique in that each individual component is decentralized to become a jigsaw piece in a larger puzzle. And as far as many of these critics are concerned, The Acolyte has broken that puzzle. Now, as of this writing, a bunch of people are planning a funeral for a franchise for Star Wars on July 17th. This funeral is being funded by Chris Gore.
And get ready for pronouns in Star Wars.
Now, him saying that Star Wars is dead now is quite interesting because a few years before the Disney purchase, back in 2010, he was involved with The People vs. George Lucas, a documentary centered on how Star Wars had died, and it was George Lucas's fault.
If he was making it for kids, do kids really care about trade federation and tariffs and taxes and Senate meetings and blah, 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 blah?
So I look forward to Chris Gore arranging another funeral for Star Wars in 15 years from now when something else happens, because apparently it's a 15-year thing. So what's the takeaway from all this? What do we learn deconstructing the criticisms of The Acolyte? Well, a few things. One, Star Wars criticism doesn't appear to be centered on the quality of the individual piece, rather how it fits into the general discourse around the saga as a whole. There's a problem with a lot of long-running franchises, but with Star Wars, it's at a different extreme. Now, something I want to point out to right now, these reviews aren't necessarily a reflection of the whole of the Star Wars audience. In fact, it's impossible to really get that answer because the Star Wars audience is so massive. There is no real consensus.
Everyone. For everyone.
For everyone.
For everyone. Star Wars is for everyone.
Regardless of race?
Regardless of religion.
Regardless of gender.
Or mental illness.
Unfortunately, Disney Star Wars is not for everyone.
Every single Disney Star Wars show,
movie, comic book,
and video game
isn't canon.
But the expanded universe is.
Always has been.
Always will be.
If you disagree,
maybe Star Wars just isn't for you.
Social media should be a place where we can
share our love of the franchise.
Without being called racist,
misogynistic,
bigots.
There's no room for pronouns.
Shippers, Dave Filoni, or Harvey Weinstein's former personal assistant.
In the galaxy far.
Are you serious?
When Wikipedia editors were being harassed for adjusting the site to match the current canon, legions of Star Wars fans turned out in support with the hashtag #WeStandWithWikipedia. It trended across the web, and it proved something that a lot of Star Wars fans, embroiled in anger, need to hear. They're not the only voice of the fandom. There's many voices out there. They just happen to be loud.
More of us.
There is way more of us.
It's way more of us.
There's way more of us.
There are dozens of us. Dozens!
The problem also is that by acting like the Acolyte has to work as a machine cog in a greater system, you devalue every individual piece of the saga. It's no longer, is the Acolyte good or bad? It's, how does the Acolyte make Star Wars better or worse? We're not looking at the show as an individual piece, we're looking at it as the whole of Star Wars, that its failure or success reflects on this massive 40-year legacy, which is unfair to any show. No show could endure that way, except for Andor, which is a masterpiece, but I digress.
That ends today. There is one way out.
Take the Clone Wars cartoon, for example. It wasn't good because it was a solid show with compelling characters. No. It's because it added context to episodes 2 and 3. Even the sequel trilogy. Good, bad, who cares? It impacted Luke's story from the previous trilogy. So therefore, any changes it made, that's the only thing we're going to talk about. That seems unfair to the movies or the show. Let them be made fun of for their own flaws. For their own internal logic. The problem is they're being treated as extensions of the original trilogy in all cases. Because everything in Star Wars is an extension of the original trilogy. And how it affects the legacy of those 3 films, which, by the way, have already been re-edited thanks to George Lucas years ago. So you should care more about that affecting the legacy of the original trilogy, that the original versions of the movies are still unavailable in HD to this day in their unrefined, perfect original version. But what are you going to do? We always have the despecialized editions though, so that's kind of cool. Star Wars is unique. It's one of the few franchises where every entry is part of a grander story in a way that is expansive and massive, and in a way that does impact what came before and what comes after. But the problem is we cannot devalue the individual pieces. We cannot act as though they are unimportant beyond the service they play to the whole. But the problem is also this. Our current landscape of criticism doesn't know what to do with okay stories. At the end of the day, The Acolyte is fine. It's okay. It's on par with Ahsoka in that it's entertaining, it's not boring, it keeps coming back, has the potential to be better, but it's just fine. I don't know if it has the cultural staying power to remain in conversation for another year if it wasn't anchored to Star Wars. Not like Andor or The Mandalorian anyway. The internet has turned reacting to Star Wars into a hyperbolic shouting match. Everyone has to have their opinion, and everyone has to have a strong opinion. No one's allowed to just say, it's okay. That's alright. I don't like it. It's fine. You have to say, I love it. It's the best thing in the world. Or, I hate this. This is revolting. It's ruined everything. You have to be either at the all-time best or the all-time worst. And anything between those two extremes, you don't have to do with. No one can just say, it's alright. And the people who do say, it's alright, they get grouped in with one of the other extremes by the other side. Consider this. When The Rise of Skywalker came out, Star Wars Theory initially admitted to liking at least some components of that movie.
So the beginning was cool. It starts off with a bang. The movie is strong. Like, you're just like, holy crap, like, how did we get here? You know? And it throws you right in there. Like, you see Palpatine within like the first probably like 10 minutes, 5 minutes. And it's cool. The whole thing goes along and I just felt captivated. I felt really moved. I felt like this is resonating with me. There are a lot of plot holes that are now going to affect the previous films, and I'm going to go over that in its own separate video. However, all in all, I enjoyed it. I liked it. I thought it was a fine film, you know?
But as he's continued talking about it, he's become more and more negative. Now, of course, people are allowed to change their minds, that's fine, but I can't imagine talking about Rise of Skywalker for 5 years straight and being enthusiastic about any component of it. I get sick and tired of it. I'd like, screw this, I don't want to talk about Star Wars anymore. So, I can imagine doing what he does. And I'm sure that has gotten to him talking about Star Wars repeatedly. Yeah, if you have to talk about the negatives of a movie day in and day out for your job that your business depends on, you might get sick of it too, and it would affect how you discuss the show, or the movie in this case. And that would affect other people's opinions as well. And yeah, for these guys, it pays the bills. They have to have a loud reaction. They have to be noticed. No shame to that. That's your job. Yeah, you have to be entertaining or at least compelling to your audience. So yeah, loud reactions, extreme reactions, that gets people going. I can't help but feel a lot of the reactions for The Acolyte, however, are just a little performative, considering the show is just so alright consistently. It's just fine. But because we've gotten ourselves into a hyping match, even outside of those whose livelihoods depend on it, we're being reinforced positive or negative ideas day in and day out. That's going to amp up your opinions. So just alright becomes extreme hate. I don't know how some of you guys can sit through this kind of shit all the time. Like, this is exhausting. I feel genuinely drained having watched these negative reviews. Like, there's a soul-sucking quality to it, where you're like, the misery, the abject exhaustion. Like, for 3 hours I've been watching these things, and I just feel miserable. Like, none of it made me feel good. I'm gonna watch something goofy after this, because, quite frankly, this was exhausting. I feel more tired having sat through these negative reviews than I did watching Lily Orchard. Genuinely. This is just misery-inducing. How anyone can sit through these angry, repetitive reviews where they all say the exact same thing every single time, day in and day out. I have no idea how some of you guys function if this is what you're watching. This is painful. And it's always something else. Every week there's a new piece of drama, a new reaction to this show. People were going crazy about the alien gerbils because they may have they, them pronouns, even though they use he later on in the show. And like, that same episode, the Ki-Adi-Mundi thing came out, and that eclipsed the gerbil thing by a mile. The problem is this: there has to be a new news story, and there has to be more outrage. It has to be bigger, louder, more extreme. Star Wars sustains itself as a fandom on discussion. It's sustained itself since the 70s that way. The question becomes, can we all just chill out a little bit here? It's just a show at the end of the day. We're seeing more positivity for the MCU after X-Men 97 and Deadpool and Wolverine. And that was seen as a toxic landfill of discussion right there. This isn't a new thing, however, of course. Again, the same people holding funerals for Star Wars today held a funeral for Star Wars 15 years ago with The People versus George Lucas. And before that, with all the special edition memes, like Han shot first and all that. There are a few pieces of Star Wars media that maintain a real stranglehold over society, and everything else is just all right. But we have to make that just all right stuff seem bigger than it is, because that's how the culture maintains itself. And outside of the Old Republic and Andor, nothing has really lived up to the legacy of the original trilogy. And it kind of sucks if you just want to come to this world and make something compelling and be shackle-holded to these high expectations. You can't have anything that's all right or just good. It has to be the best, and if it's not the best, it's the worst. You're going to attract a large fan base with this franchise, no matter what. Go wild with it, really. I praise The Acolyte for doing something a little different. Like a lot of mysteries, it all depends on what note it ends on. What I do know is I'll be watching until it ends, because the show has enough there that I'm hoping it will tell something good. And it will give something unique to this old saga in this galaxy that's a decent distance away.
Keeping all that in mind, I have decided...
How much do you think he spends on all the figures behind him? Man, that's a lot of money right there.